Chapter 1, The First Leaf Falls. The heat of August in Cadaqués did not fade so much as it thickened, turning heavy with the salt of the Mediterranean and the resinous scent of the sun-baked pines that clung to the rocky cliffs. It was the time of year when the frantic energy of midsummer began to curdle into something more deliberate, a period where every afternoon felt stretched thin, suspended between the brilliant glare of the sun and the inevitable cool shadow of the coming autumn. Mateo stood on the upper terrace of his family's seasonal home, his hands resting on the rough, whitewashed stone wall that had scraped his palms every summer since he was a child. Below him, the town descended in a steep, chaotic tumble of slate roofs and white facades, spilling down toward the crescent harbor where the water was a deep, unmoving indigo. Every year, the task remained exactly the same, a solitary ritual that had slowly evolved from a chore into a marker of time. As an architect, Mateo spent his months in the city dealing with the hard mathematics of steel and glass, but here, the materials were soft, worn down by generations of wind and tramontana storms. His return to the coast was always timed with the first mass departure of the seasonal tourists, those who packed their cars at dawn and left the narrow, stone-paved streets echoing with an unfamiliar emptiness. The silence that followed their exit was not immediate, it settled over the town gradually, like dust gathering on the dark wooden furniture of a house that had been left open to the elements for too long. He looked down at his palms, noting the gray dust of mortar and lime that had settled into the creases of his skin from checking the stability of the garden walls earlier that morning. There was a specific melancholy to this particular afternoon, a sense that the landscape itself was conscious of the shifting season. The fishing boats in the harbor bobbed with a slower, heavier rhythm, their brightly painted hulls faded by months of unyielding UV light. Mateo watched a single gull track a path across the horizon, its flight steady against the rising thermal currents from the cliffs. In the house behind him, the rooms were cool and dark, the thick stone walls keeping the fierce heat at bay, but the air inside felt stagnant, filled with the ghosts of summers past and the heavy knowledge that within weeks, the heavy wooden shutters would be bolted from the outside once again. He had spent the last 3 hours cataloging the repairs that would be needed before the winter damp set in, his notebook filled with sketches of roof tiles that had slipped out of alignment and iron hinges that had succumbed to the relentless rust of the sea spray. It was a tedious process, yet he clung to it because it gave him a purpose, a structure to mask the aimless drift that always accompanied the end of a vacation. He walked down the narrow, external staircase, his leather soles clicking sharply against the stone, a sound that seemed to travel remarkably far in the quiet neighborhood. The air at street level was hotter, trapped between the high garden walls where bougainvillea poured over the stone in violent bursts of magenta, though even these flowers were beginning to look dry and parched at the edges, exhausted by their own blooming. Diego's house was only 3 doors down, its entrance marked by a pair of terracotta pots containing shriveled geraniums that had survived on negligence and sporadic rain. Mateo didn't knock, instead, he paused by the iron gate, looking through the bars into the shaded courtyard where an empty canvas chair sat beneath a fig tree. The absence of his friend was a reminder that the town had its own permanent rhythm, one that carried on long after the summer residents packed their bags, a life of quiet winters and local gossip that Mateo could only ever observe from the periphery. Turning toward the sea, Mateo navigated the labyrinth of alleys, his feet finding the smooth, dark slate stones that paved the ancient pathways. The stones were polished to a high sheen by centuries of footsteps, slick beneath his shoes even in the dry heat. As he emerged onto the main promenade, the perspective opened up to reveal the vast, glittering expanse of the bay. The beach was half empty now, the rows of rental umbrellas significantly thinned, leaving wide patches of gray pebble sand exposed to the sun like scars. A few children still played near the water's edge, their high-pitched shouts muffled by the steady, rhythmic crash of the small waves breaking against the shore. Mateo found a stone bench beneath the shade of a dusty palm tree and sat down, unfolding his notebook on his knee but leaving the pen untouched. He simply watched the light change, the brilliant white glare of midday dissolving into a deeper, amber hue that lengthened the shadows of the fishing nets drying on the stone piers. The day was dying slowly, beautifully, and with a precision that felt almost cruel, marking the end of another year's youth. Chapter 2, The Horizon Shifts. The transition from late afternoon to evening in the square of Cadaqués was always marked by a subtle change in the velocity of the wind. As the sun dipped behind the steep ridges of the Painy Mountain, the blinding glare on the whitewashed buildings fractured into shades of pale violet and amber. This particular evening carried the extra weight of the town's final summer festival, a centuries-old celebration that felt less like an invitation to outsiders and more like a private closing ceremony for the people who belonged to the coast. Strings of small, yellow incandescent bulbs had been stretched across the plaza, sagging under their own weight between the balconies of the old stone townhouses. Mateo moved through the gathering crowd with a slow, practiced ease, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his shoulders brushing occasionally against neighbors he had known for decades but rarely spoke to. The air was a thick mixture of fried dough from the temporary food stalls, roasted green peppers, and the omnipresent, sharp undertone of the dry sea grass warming on the shore nearby. It was within this dense choreography of movement that the rhythm of the entire summer shifted. Mateo had stopped near the edge of the fountain, where the cool stone basin offered a slight reprieve from the heat of the tightly packed bodies. He was watching the older musicians arrange their heavy wooden chairs on the temporary wooden stage, their slow, deliberate movements mirroring the general fatigue of the season's end. When he turned his head to follow the flight of a stray balloon, his gaze caught on a silhouette standing near the arched entryway of the old textile cooperative. It was Elena. She was standing slightly apart from the crowd, her back pressed lightly against the cool, dark stone of the archway, watching the square with an intensity that suggested she was trying to memorize the exact placement of every person and every light bulb. The ambient glow from the festival strings caught the fine texture of her linen shirt, illuminating her with a soft, editorial clarity that separated her completely from the chaotic motion around her. For several long moments, the distance between them seemed to compress. Mateo did not move, and neither did she, but a profound, unspoken recognition established itself across the noisy expanse of the plaza. It was a look that carried no urgency, no immediate demand for action, but rather the quiet acknowledgement of two people who understood exactly what it meant to be temporary fixtures in a permanent place. Mateo noticed the way she held a small notebook in her left hand, her thumb tracing the edge of the pages in a repetitive, rhythmic circle, a gesture that immediately resonated with his own habit of carrying a sketchbook through these very same alleys. She was here, but her posture, the slight tilt of her head, and the way she seemed to absorb the sights rather than participate in them, betrayed the fact that her true life, her daily routine, existed somewhere far beyond the northern border, where the light was cold and the summers were short. The music began without warning, a sharp, brassy cadence that rippled through the crowd and forced everyone to adjust their stance. A group of local dancers moved into the center of the square, their interlocking hands creating a human wall that broke the direct line of sight between the fountain and the stone archway. Mateo shifted his position, stepping onto the raised base of the fountain to look over the bobbing heads of the spectators, but the space beneath the textile cooperative was already empty. Only the dark, cool shadow of the stone arch remained, framed by the bright yellow festival lights. The sudden disappearance left a strange, hollow sensation in his chest, a sudden awareness that the familiar layout of the town had grown unpredictable. He looked over toward the edge of the square, where Diego was standing with a group of local fishermen, laughing at some shared joke, completely anchored in the reality of the evening. Mateo felt a sudden, sharp disconnect from his friend's easy familiarity. The landscape had rearranged itself around that single, brief encounter, and the remaining days of August suddenly felt incredibly short, like sand slipping through a cracked hourglass. He left the festival early, navigating the darkening labyrinth of the upper town where the music from the square became a distant, rhythmic thumping against the ancient walls. The night air was turning cooler, the mountain breeze finally pushing the heavy sea humidity out to the open water. As he walked, his mind kept returning to the image of the linen shirt against the dark stone, the texture of the fabric, and the quiet stillness she had maintained amidst the noise. He realized he was walking faster than usual, his leather sole striking the slate stones with a frantic pace that didn't match the heavy, nostalgic quiet of the night. When he reached his terrace, he didn't turn on the lamps. He simply stood in the darkness, looking down at the scattered lights of the harbor and the faint, glowing square below, knowing that the solitary comfort of his summer routine had been permanently disrupted. Chapter 3, Shaded Paths. The morning after the festival brought an intense, crystalline clarity to the sky, the kind of light that only appeared when the northern tramontana wind blew hard across the rocky peninsula of Cap de Creus. The wind had scrubbed the atmosphere clean of the previous night's humidity, leaving the sea a sharp, sparkling cobalt and the whitewashed walls of the upper town almost painfully bright to look at. Mateo left his house early, his sketchbook tucked securely under his arm, intending to escape the rising heat by heading toward the ancient, stone-paved paths that winded along the olive groves outside the town's perimeter. These paths, built generations ago by farmers who had painstakingly terraced the steep hillsides with dry stone walls, were completely deserted at this hour. The only movement came from the silver-green leaves of the stunted olive trees, turning and flashing in the steady breeze like thousands of tiny mirrors. As the path narrowed, ascending sharply through a steep ravine where the smell of wild rosemary and crushed thyme was overpowering, Mateo slowed his pace. The physical effort of the climb usually helped clear his mind, but today his thoughts remained stubbornly fixed on the stone archway of the plaza. He stopped to examine a section of a dry stone wall that had partially collapsed, the rough slate pieces scattered across the dirt path like a puzzle. As he knelt to move a particularly heavy fragment out of the walkway, the sound of light, rhythmic footsteps approaching from around the bend caused him to freeze. A moment later, Elena appeared. She was walking with her head down, her eyes fixed on the uneven stones beneath her feet, dressed in a simple dark dress that fluttered violently against her shins in the wind. She carried a canvas tote bag filled with what looked like skeins of dyed yarn and small bundles of dried local plants, the raw materials of her craft. The surprise of the encounter was mutual, yet neither of them broke the silence that the mountain wind seemed to enforce. As Elena looked up and recognized him, her step faltered for a fraction of a second before she resumed her steady forward momentum. Mateo stood up, wiping the pale stone dust from his fingers onto his trousers, and stepped off the narrow trail onto a flat ledge of rock to give her room to pass. Instead of walking by, however, her pace slowed to match his stationary position. Without a word or a formal greeting, she paused beside him, her gaze turning outward toward the vast panoramic view of the bay that opened up from this high vantage point. The town below looked microscopic, a tiny cluster of white cells clinging to the edge of an immense, indifferent sea. For several minutes, they stood side by side on the exposed ridge, the wind roaring past their ears and pulling at their clothes. The physical proximity was hypercharged with the awareness of the previous night's shared glance, yet the absence of dialogue felt entirely natural, a necessary boundary that protected the fragile reality of their connection. Mateo observed the profile of her face against the blue sky, the line of her jaw tight with a quiet determination, her eyes slightly squinted against the fierce glare of the sun. He noticed the ink stains on the tips of her fingers, a detail that spoke of long hours spent sketching patterns or mixing dyes, a dedication to tangible, handmade beauty that mirrored his own obsession with architectural form. They were two creators, completely isolated on a windswept mountain in Spain, connected by nothing more than a shared appreciation for the fleeting nature of the landscape before them. When Elena finally turned back to the path, she did not accelerate to leave him behind. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her canvas bag and continued up the mountain at a deliberate, measured pace that left an unspoken invitation hanging in the air. Mateo stepped back onto the path, falling into stride exactly 2 paces behind her. The rhythm of their walk became a silent conversation. Every time the path twisted sharply over a loose patch of slate, Mateo would subconsciously extend a hand, providing a steadying presence without actually touching her, while Elena would point out a rare mountain flower or a peculiarly shaped shadow with a brief gesture of her hand. The shared journey lasted for nearly an hour, a long, meditative ascent through the shaded olive groves and sun-bleached rocks where the passage of time was marked only by the shifting length of their shadows on the ancient stone. By the time the path began to descend toward the eastern coves, the invisible distance that had separated them in the crowded square had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, nostalgic understanding that would define the rest of their short summer together. Chapter 4: The Shared Table. The midday heat of late August always forced a collective retreat into the deep, cavernous shadows of the seaside cafés that lined the harbor promenade. The brilliant, blinding white glare of the sun on the water became too intense to bear, transforming the open spaces of the town into a quiet wasteland while the covered terraces buzzed with a low, hummed energy. Diego had chosen a corner table at the oldest tavern on the pier, a place where the air inside always smelled faintly of spilled red wine, old barrels, and the bitter charcoal from the kitchen grill. The heavy wooden table, scarred by decades of knives and salt water, was large enough for 6, but today it served as the anchor for 4 distinct lives that were beginning to intersect in ways that none of them could openly acknowledge. Mateo sat with his back against the thick stone pillar, his eyes tracking the slow condensation rolling down the side of his glass of chilled white wine, fully aware of the delicate geometry that had just been established. Diego had initiated the gathering, his easy, unbrained hospitality drawing people together with the effortless charm of someone who had never known the anxiety of leaving his birthplace. He sat at the head of the table, his sun-darkened forearms resting flat against the wood, his laughter occasionally booming across the small space as he gestured toward a plate of salted anchovies and dark olives. Directly across from him sat Sofia, Elena's older sister, whose presence introduced a sharp, pragmatic energy to the room. Sofia was looking over a collection of old legal documents and property descriptions spread across a clear corner of the table, her pencil making quick, precise notations in the margins. Her presence was a reminder of the real world, the logistics of inheritance, the valuation of their grandmother's old house in the upper quarter, and the impending end of their stay on the coast. She represented the unyielding timeline that governed the remaining days of the summer. Between Mateo and Sofia sat Elena. The proximity was almost overwhelming in the tight confines of the tavern booth. Elena's focus was divided between her sister's paperwork and the small window that looked out onto the shimmering harbor, where the masts of the sailboats rocked in a lazy, synchronized dance. The unspoken history of the mountain path from the previous morning hung between her and Mateo like a physical object, invisible to the others but heavy with meaning. Every time Diego reached across the table to pass a dish, or every time Sofia sighed heavily over a difficult clause in a property deed, Mateo and Elena would share a fleeting, hyper-aware look. It was a silent dialogue of micro-movements, the slight tilt of Elena's shoulder away from her sister, the way Mateo carefully aligned his notebook parallel to her sketchpad, the rhythmic clicking of a pen that matched the steady pace of her breathing. The contrast between the two pairs at the table grew more pronounced as the afternoon wore on. Diego and Sofia operated in the realm of the tangible and the immediate, their interactions defined by the loud, familiar rhythms of old acquaintances discussing the future of a house and the history of a town. They belonged to the structure of the place. Meanwhile, Mateo and Elena existed in a parallel, insulated reality, a quiet pocket of air where the only things that mattered were the subtle shifts in light and the heavy, nostalgic knowledge that their time together was fundamentally borrowed. Mateo watched a single ray of sunlight pierce through the wooden slatted blinds, illuminating a thin trail of dust motes that danced between him and Elena before striking the rough grain of the table. Elena noticed it too. She reached out her hand, letting her fingers hover just millimeters below the beam of light, her skin catching the golden warmth for a brief second before she pulled back, her eyes meeting Mateo's with a profound, melancholic understanding. When the afternoon finally began to cool and the shadows on the pier lengthened into long, blue ribbons, Sofia gathered her papers with a decisive snap, breaking the spell that had held the table in suspension. Diego stood up to settle the bill at the counter, his loud voice exchanging final pleasantries with the bartender, while Sofia stepped outside to check the afternoon mail. For a single, fleeting minute, Mateo and Elena were left alone at the long wooden table. Neither of them spoke, and neither of them reached out, but the silence between them was absolute, a perfect, unbroken vacuum that contained all the words they were choosing not to say. They simply sat in the fading amber light of the tavern, watching the dust settle back onto the scarred wood, both of them acutely aware that the shared table was merely a temporary harbor before the current of the coming autumn pulled them in separate directions. Chapter 5, Traces in the Sand. The twilight that followed the long afternoon at the tavern was unusually cool, carrying a sharp, damp breeze from the open sea that drove the last remaining sunbathers away from the shoreline. By 8 o'clock, the main beach of Cadaqués had transformed into a vast, silent expanse of gray pebbles and coarse sand, completely stripped of the colorful umbrellas and plastic chairs that had defined its summer landscape. Elena walked slowly along the water's edge, her leather sandals slung over her shoulder by their straps, her bare feet sinking slightly into the cold, wet grit with every step. The tide was pulling back, leaving behind a dark, glittering ribbon of wet stones and tangled strands of brown kelp that smelled strongly of iodine and deep ocean currents. She kept her head down, watching the white foam of the small waves wash over her ankles before receding with a soft, hissing sound that seemed to mimic the steady exhalation of the dying day. She had left her sister Sophia at the house, still immersed in the endless stacks of family photographs and old tax receipts, a domestic world that felt increasingly claustrophobic as the days grew shorter. Elena needed the vastness of the horizon to balance the tight, structured reality that was waiting for her back in her northern studio. As she rounded the rocky promontory that separated the main beach from the smaller, more secluded inlet near the old customs house, she stopped. A single figure was sitting on an overturned wooden dory that had been dragged high up onto the gravel path, well out of reach of the high tide. It was Mateo. He was dressed in a dark wool sweater against the evening chill, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as he stared out at the flashing light of the distant lighthouse on Cap de Creus. The surprise of seeing him there was tempered by a strange sense of inevitability, as if the landscape itself was systematically drawing them to the same coordinates every time the sun went down. Mateo did not turn his head when her footsteps crunched against the loose gravel. Instead, he simply shifted his position on the weathered wood of the boat, leaving a clear, empty space on the smooth, salt-bleached surface beside him. Elena approached without hesitation, her movements fluid and silent in the dimming light. She climbed up onto the dory, her bare feet dangling a few inches above the sand, her shoulders settling into a position that was only a breath away from his. The proximity was comforting, a solid anchor against the immense, dark void of the sea stretching out before them. For a long time, the only movement came from the steady, rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam, cutting a sharp yellow path across the black water every 11 seconds. With each pass of the light, the contours of Mateo's profile were briefly illuminated, the sharp angle of his nose, the thoughtful set of his brow, and the absolute stillness of his posture. Elena reached down into her tote bag, her fingers finding a small, smooth piece of green sea glass she had picked up earlier. She placed it gently on the wooden seat between them. Mateo's eyes tracked the movement. He reached out, his thumb catching the frosted edge of the glass, rolling it over to catch the faint ambient light from the town lamps behind them. It was a simple, wordless exchange, a gesture that acknowledged their shared habit of collecting the fragments of this coast before they were forced to leave it. The darkness deepened until the line separating the sea from the night sky disappeared completely, leaving only the white crests of the breaking waves to mark the boundary of the shore. The cold wind picked up, causing Elena to shiver slightly, a quick, involuntary movement that did not escape Mateo's attention. Without a word, he leaned back, pulling a heavy, faded canvas jacket from the bow of the overturned boat and draping it gently over her shoulders. The fabric was stiff with salt and smelled faintly of tobacco, pine resin, and the dry stone of his terrace, the exact sensory map of his summer existence. Elena pulled the jacket tightly around herself, burying her chin in the high collar, her eyes meeting his through the shadows with a profound, nostalgic intensity that required no explanation. They sat together in the cold, dark cradle of the old dory until the lights of the town began to extinguish one by one, both of them fully aware that the traces they were leaving in the sand would be completely erased by the morning tide. Chapter 6: The Weight of Brick and Mortar. The first day of September arrived with a stark alteration in the soundscape of the upper quarter. The gentle, rhythmic humming of distant cicadas that had provided the background soundtrack for the past 2 months was abruptly replaced by the harsh, metallic rasp of a heavy iron key turning in an ancient lock. Sophia stood in the center of their grandmother's high-ceilinged salon, her silhouette dark against the massive vertical shafts of sunlight that pierced through the slats of the wooden blinds. She did not waste time with sentiment, her movements were swift, efficient, and dictated entirely by a thick legal clipboard she held under her arm. With a systematic focus, she began pulling the heavy white drop cloths over the high-backed velvet armchairs, her actions raising small, golden clouds of dust that danced lazily in the stagnant air before settling onto the polished terracotta floor tiles. Elena stood in the doorway, her hands gripping the faded wooden frame, watching her sister systematically dismantle the interior landscape of their childhood. Sophia represented the unyielding march of reality, the executor of a past that could no longer be sustained financially. For Sophia, each room was an inventory of square meters, structural integrity, and liquid assets that needed to be finalized before the autumn rains made the mountain roads treacherous. She moved to the massive oak sideboard, opening the heavy drawers with a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks, removing the heavy silver cutlery and wrapping each piece in thick gray felt. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the empty house like a countdown clock, each strike marking a second lost from the remaining week of their vacation. It was a physical manifestation of a deadline, a visual and auditory reminder to Elena that her anchor to this specific coast was being deliberately unmoored. The physical labor of the house clearance soon extended to the heavy trunk stored in the dark, limestone cellar. Sophia required assistance with the massive wicker hampers filled with decades of linens, and it was Diego who arrived to provide the heavy muscle, his easygoing nature bringing a brief, grounding presence to the somber environment. Mateo followed shortly after, ostensibly to inspect the shifting foundation of the old kitchen hearth at Sophia's request, but his true focus never wavered from the quiet figure standing in the corner of the dim room. As Diego hoisted a massive trunk onto his broad shoulders, his boots scraping loudly against the stone steps, Mateo stepped into the narrow space between the high wooden shelves where Elena was sorting through a crate of old ceramic tiles. The proximity in the cramped, dust-filled pantry was intense, framed by the loud, practical sounds of Diego and Sophia organizing the transport logistics in the hallway outside. Elena held a single white tile in her hands, her fingers tracing the hand-painted blue leaf pattern that had faded unevenly over 50 years. Mateo reached out, his hand entering her field of vision, his fingers gently brushing against the opposite edge of the ceramic square. He did not take it from her, instead, they held the fragile piece of clay between them, their thumbs nearly touching over the glazed surface. The silence between them in that small room was absolute, a perfect contrast to the heavy, bureaucratic scraping of furniture happening just a few feet away. In that shared grasp, Mateo could feel the slight tremor in her fingers, a silent expression of the grief she was refusing to show her sister, while his steady, firm hold offered a silent promise of endurance. When Sophia's sharp footsteps approached the pantry door, Mateo smoothly transitioned his movement, taking the heavy crate from Elena's hands just as her sister entered with her clipboard. The moment dissolved into the practical routine of loading the waiting truck, but the internal landscape had been permanently altered. As the afternoon waned, the house grew progressively emptier, its high walls bouncing the sound of their footsteps back to them with a hollow, echoing quality that felt like a preview of the coming winter. Elena walked to the window, looking out through the open slats at the harbor below, where the water was turning a deep, bruised purple in the twilight. She knew that the brick and mortar of this place would soon belong to a stranger, but as she looked over her shoulder and caught Mateo's steady, unblinking gaze from across the stripped room, she realized that some architectures were built entirely out of memories, completely immune to the logistics of sale or departure. Chapter 7, A Change in the Light. The fierce, white glare that had characterized the peak of August began to undergo a profound transformation during the first week of September. It was a subtle, optical shift that only those who spent their lives observing spaces could truly appreciate. The sun no longer rode high and tyrannical at noon, instead, its arc had flattened, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretched across the steep alleys of Cadaqués like dark ribbons of ink. This new, golden light was softer, more editorial, catching the rough textures of the stone walls and the peeling paint of the old wooden doors with an intimacy that the harsh summer sun had always flattened. Mateo sat on a low stone step in the labyrinth of the upper quarter, his large leather-bound notebook open on his knees, his charcoal pencil scratching a rapid series of parallel lines to capture the precise angle of a shadow thrown by a low-hanging archway. The silence of the afternoon was deep and meditative, broken only by the dry, paper-like rustle of the palm fronds overhead as they brushed against the hot stone of a terrace. Mateo stopped his pencil, his eyes tracking the way the amber light pooled on the slate pavers at his feet, turning the dark gray stones into a golden mosaic. A shadow fell across his page, breaking the pattern of his lines. He looked up to find Elena standing a few feet away, her shoulder resting lightly against the whitewashed facade of an old fisherman's cottage. She was watching him work, her expression relaxed, her eyes half closed against the warm, horizontal rays of the setting sun. She wore a simple, sleeveless blouse of a faded clay color, her bare arms catching the rich, orange glow of the late afternoon until her skin seemed to radiate the very warmth of the stones around them. Without a single word, she walked over and sat down beside him on the narrow stone step. The space was tight, forcing her hip to rest firmly against his thigh, her shoulder settling into the familiar, comforting contour of his side. Mateo did not close his notebook. Instead, he held it steady between them, an open invitation to share in his solitary observation of the town. Elena reached out, her fingers hovering over the paper for a moment before she pointed toward a specific corner of his drawing, a delicate representation of the overlapping roof tiles on the church below. Her fingernail, short and neat, left a tiny, microscopic indentation in the soft paper right where the shadow met the light. It was an act of collaboration without instruction, a quiet agreement that they were looking at the exact same world through the exact same lens. As the sun sank lower, the amber light shifted into a deep, burning crimson, casting their combined shadow long and distorted down the length of the empty alley. The two figures on the wall became a single, elongated shape that stretched across the dark slate pavers, climbing up the opposite wall until it dissolved into the high vines of a parched grape arbor. Mateo turned his head slightly, his gaze catching the way the fading crimson light illuminated the fine, stray hairs at the nape of Elena's neck, turning them into threads of pure gold. Elena felt his look, she turned her face toward his, her eyes dark and completely unreadable in the twilight, yet filled with a nostalgic weight that seemed to acknowledge the cruel precision of the passing minutes. They were sitting on a crumbling step in a town that was falling asleep for the winter, fully aware that this specific quality of light, and this specific configuration of their lives, would never occur in exactly the same way again. The final sliver of the sun disappeared behind the Painey mountain, and the warm, golden glow was instantly replaced by the cool, blue dusk of the Mediterranean evening. A sharp breeze rattled the iron handles of the window shutters nearby, a sudden reminder that the safety of the afternoon had vanished. Elena stood up, her movements slower now, as if the cold air had made her limbs heavy with the realization of the coming night. She smoothed her skirt, her fingers lingering on the fabric for a fraction of a second before she extended her bare hand to Mateo. He took it, his large, rough palm swallowing her fingers completely, pulling himself up from the stone step. They stood together in the blue twilight for a single, unbroken minute, their hands still joined, watching the first street lamp flick on at the corner of the alley with a dull, yellow hum. It was the signal that the day was over, and as they finally let go, their fingers dragging slowly apart, the cold air rushed into the empty space between them, marking the boundary of another day lost to the autumn. Chapter 8, The Unspoken Promise. The night air along the coastal highway that connected Cadaqués to the rugged cliffs of Cadaqués was sharp, smelling heavily of crushed slate, dry wild fennel, and the cold, salt-laden wind of the open sea. It was nearly midnight, an hour when the town below had pulled its shutters tight against the dark, leaving the mountain roads entirely to the shadows and the sporadic beams of passing headlights. Diego drove his old, dented off-road vehicle with a casual, one-handed confidence born of a lifetime spent navigating these treacherous hairpins. The engine roared a low, mechanical growl that bounced off the high stone embankments, a steady, vibrating rhythm that seemed to isolate the vehicle from the vast, silent darkness stretching out on either side of the asphalt. Mateo sat in the passenger seat, his window rolled down halfway despite the chill, letting the fierce wind whip through his hair and cool his face. His left arm rested flat against the metal frame of the door, his eyes fixed on the distant, black horizon where the sea met the night sky without a visible boundary. They had spent the last 2 hours helping Diego secure a set of heavy wooden fishing skiffs on the eastern beach, preparing the vessels for the rough autumn swells that were predicted to arrive by the weekend. The physical exertion had left Mateo's muscles aching with a satisfying fatigue, but his mind remained hyper-alert, completely detached from his friend's easy, whistling composure. Diego was a creature of the present, untroubled by the shifting of the calendar, whereas Mateo felt every passing hour like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. As the vehicle rounded a sharp, elevated crest where the road precariously hugged the cliffside, the entire layout of the bay revealed itself below them like a map drawn in sparks of white and yellow. The town was a small, glowing crescent of lights hugging the dark water, its shape perfectly defined by the curved line of the harbor lamps. Mateo's gaze automatically bypassed the central promenade and the bright cluster of the main square, tracking up the dark, steep silhouette of the upper quarter until his eyes found a single, faint amber light burning behind a set of familiar wooden shutters. It was Elena's house. The window was a tiny, fragile speck of warmth against the immense, indifferent blackness of the mountain, yet it acted as a powerful gravity well, drawing his focus so completely that the rest of the landscape faded into an unrecognizable blur. The realization of how much his internal landscape had shifted came without warning, a sharp, sudden clarity that matched the coldness of the night wind. He looked at the distant light and felt a profound sense of nostalgic longing that was already mourning the conclusion of a story that hadn't even finished its main chapter. He knew that within days, that specific window would be dark, the house sold, and the linen shirt he had watched in the plaza packed away into a suitcase bound for a distant northern city. Yet, staring at that solitary flame through the dark, Mateo felt an unspoken promise solidify within himself, a quiet, stubborn commitment to preserve the precise memory of this summer, to hold on to the texture of the white stone and the quiet, dialogue-free hours they had shared, ensuring that her presence on this coast would remain permanent long after her departure. Diego noticed his friend's prolonged silence, his eyes darting briefly from the dark road to Mateo's fixed profile before returning to the asphalt. With a slow, deliberate movement, Diego reached over and switched off the vehicle's radio, letting the raw roar of the wind and the rhythmic hum of the tires fill the small cabin completely. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken empathy from a childhood friend who understood the language of silence better than any formal declaration. Diego didn't need to ask what Mateo was looking at, he had seen the trajectory of his friend's gaze, and his quiet action was an acknowledgement of the heavy, bittersweet weight that Mateo was carrying. The vehicle began its long, winding descent back toward the valley, the headlights cutting wide, sweeping arcs across the dry olive terraces, while Mateo kept his eyes locked on that fading amber speck in the hills until the high stone walls of the lower town finally rose up to block it from view, leaving him alone in the dark with his silent vow. Chapter 9, White Stone, Soft Shadows. The midday heat had settled over the historic center of Cadaqués like a heavy, invisible weight, pressing the remaining humidity out of the narrow alleys until the air smelled strictly of dry mortar, sun-baked stone, and the distant, bitter oil of the olive presses. It was the hour when the town completely closed its eyes, a period of absolute stillness where the only signs of life were the stray cat sleeping in the narrow strip of shade beneath the stone staircases. Elena walked slowly up the steep incline of the Cadaqués, her bare shoulders brushing occasionally against the rough, whitewashed facades of the ancient houses. The stone was so clean, so intensely white, that it reflected the sun like a mirror, forcing her to look down at the dark, patterned slate pavers beneath her feet. She carried a small bundle of linen thread she had spent the morning washing in the sea, the wet fibers leaving a faint, dark trail of drops on the dry stone behind her. She was acutely aware of the footsteps that had fallen into sync with hers 3 turnings ago. Mateo was walking a few paces behind her, his large, solid frame casting a long, dark silhouette that stretched forward along the white walls, almost touching the hem of her skirt. He did not attempt to close the distance, nor did he look away. Instead, he maintained a deliberate, respectful margin that allowed them to move through the labyrinth as a single, coordinated unit. The silence between them was not a barrier, but a shared space, a mutual agreement to let the heavy, cinematic atmosphere of the afternoon dictate their rhythm. Every time Elena paused to admire a specific detail, a rusted iron balcony dripping with dry pink bougainvillea, or a hand-carved wooden lintel over an abandoned doorway, Mateo would stop exactly where he was, his hand resting flat against the white stone, waiting for her to resume her journey. As they reached the highest point of the ridge, where the alley opened into a small, secluded courtyard framed by 2 massive archways, the light underwent a dramatic shift. The high walls of the surrounding townhouses blocked the direct rays of the sun, plunging the courtyard into a cool, blue-gray shadow that felt like stepping into an underground chapel. Elena stopped in the center of the square, where an old limestone well sat covered in a green layer of ivy. She turned around slowly, her movements fluid and deliberate, her back pressing against the cool stone rim of the well. Mateo stepped out of the bright white glare of the alley and into the shade, his boots clicking softly against the dark slate until he stood only 2 feet away from her, his shadow finally overtaking hers completely. The physical proximity in the absolute quiet of the courtyard was profound. The world outside, the logistics of Sofia packing the estate, the practical concerns of Diego at the harbor, seemed to belong to a completely different dimension. Elena held the bundle of linen threads between her hands, her fingers weaving the damp fibers into a complex, spontaneous knot, her thumb tracing the texture of the material with a rhythmic focus. Mateo watched her hands, his eyes tracking the precise, technical movements of her fingers with the deep appreciation of a man who understood the language of structure and form. Without speaking, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, polished piece of local olive wood he had carved during his solitary hours on the terrace. He held it out on his flat palm, a silent offering that represented the hard, enduring substance of the coast she was about to leave. Elena looked from the carved wood to his face, her eyes wide and dark in the soft shadows of the archway. She did not take the token immediately, instead, she reached out her hand, her ink-stained fingers hovering over his palm for a long second before her fingertips made light, delicate contact with his skin. The warmth of his hand contrasted sharply with the cool shade of the courtyard, a sudden, electric reminder of the physical reality that lay beneath their silent understanding. They stood frozen in that precise configuration, their shadows merged on the white stone wall behind them, their fingers connected over a piece of olive wood, while the distant bells of the church struck 3 o'clock, the heavy, metallic tones echoing through the empty alleys like an afternoon knell, marking another fragment of their shared summer slipping away into the past. Chapter 10, The Midpoint Storm. The transition from the oppressive, static heat of early September to the sudden violence of the first autumn squall occurred with a frightening, cinematic speed. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the brilliant cobalt sky that had defined the Spanish coast for months was systematically swallowed by a massive wall of purple-black clouds rolling in from the Gulf of Lion. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that the heavy timber doors of the harbor warehouses groaned against their iron hinges, and the sea, which had been as flat and smooth as a sheet of glass, began to churn with a restless, greasy energy. Mateo had been walking near the old shipyards at the northern edge of the bay when the first drop of rain struck the dry slate pavement with a sharp, metallic sound like a coin hitting stone. Within minutes, the sky opened completely, unleashing a torrential downpour that transformed the steep, narrow alleys of the town into rushing torrents of muddy water and washed away the months of accumulated salt crust from the white walls. Seeking immediate shelter from the freezing deluge, Mateo ducked beneath the deep, sagging corrugated iron awning of an abandoned wooden boathouse that sat precariously on the rocky shoreline. The structure was ancient, its timbers blackened by decades of sea spray and oil, smelling heavily of wet hemp, rotted pine, and the damp, earthy floor of the coastal shelf. As he shook the water from his heavy wool sweater and adjusted his damp leather notebook beneath his arm, a sudden movement in the dark recesses of the shelter caught his eye. He was not alone. Stranded by the same sudden fury of the elements, Elena, Sofia, and Diego were already gathered there, huddled together near a stack of dry canvas sails that had been stored high off the damp ground. The 4 of them were trapped in a space no larger than a few square meters, the roaring sheet of water falling from the iron lip of the roof creating an absolute, impenetrable curtain that cut them off from the rest of the world. The environment inside the boathouse was thick with an intense, concentrated silence that contrasted sharply with the deafening thunderclaps shaking the fragile roof overhead. Without the possibility of conversation, the raw roar of the storm on the iron awning making any spoken word impossible, the interactions between the 4 characters were stripped down to the pure language of posture and gaze. Diego sat on an overturned wooden crate, his large hands busy with a short piece of rope, tying and untying a series of complex maritime knots with a rapid, mechanical focus that betrayed his internal restlessness. He belonged to the sea, and a storm like this meant hours of hard, dangerous work ahead to secure the harbor docks. Beside him, Sofia stood straight and rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes fixed on the gray, violent waves crashing against the rocks just outside. She held her constant legal clipboard tightly against her ribs like a shield, her jaw clenched as she watched the storm delay the arrival of the moving truck, her practical timeline being actively dismantled by the weather. In the deepest shadow of the timber frame, Mateo and Elena stood only a breath apart. The physical closeness was amplified by the cold, damp air that made their breathing visible in the dim light, two faint plumes of mist that rose and mingled in the space between them. Elena was shivering slightly, her thin linen blouse soaked through at the shoulders where the rain had caught her before she reached the shelter. Mateo observed the small, rhythmic tremor of her hands, and without a moment's hesitation, he stepped closer, his large frame blocking the freezing draft that whistled through the gaps in the wooden planks. He did not reach out to touch her, but his presence was a solid, radiating wall of warmth in the dark room. Elena looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the sudden, brilliant flashes of lightning that illuminated the boathouse through the open doorway. There was no fear in her expression, only a deep, nostalgic resignation that seemed to recognize the storm as the true, unyielding midpoint of their summer, the moment where the illusion of permanence was finally shattered by the arrival of the autumn cycle. For over an hour, the four individuals remained frozen in this tense, quiet contemplation of the shifting season, a perfectly balanced square of human energy suspended inside the roaring belly of the squall. Mateo reached down, his fingers lightly brushing against the wet canvas sail beside him, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. In the brief, electric glare of the lightning, they shared a look that carried the absolute weight of their unspoken future. They both knew that once the rain stopped and the sky cleared, the ground beneath their feet would be colder, the house clearance would resume with a renewed urgency, and the remaining days before her flight would begin to accelerate. When the thunder finally began to recede into a distant, hollow rumble over the open water and the heavy downpour settled into a steady, quiet drizzle, the unity of the shelter dissolved. Diego stood up first, pushing open the creaking wooden door to inspect the harbor, while Sofia stepped out into the damp lane, her pencil already active on her clipboard. Mateo and Elena were left for one final, lingering second in the dark, wet cave of the boathouse, watching the last heavy drops of rain fall from the iron roof, both of them fully aware that the weather had just broken the summer beyond repair. Chapter 11, Clearing the Dust. The rain had left the air washed thin and cold, stripped of the heavy Mediterranean humidity that had protected the town all through July and August. The morning sun rose over the hills of Cadaqués with a sharp, pale yellow clarity that did not warm the stone so much as it exposed its flaws, revealing every crack in the white plaster and every weathered splinter in the old timber doors. Inside the grandmother's house, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of vinegar, lemon oil, and the dry, chalky odor of old mortar. Sofia had opened the massive wooden shutters of the main salon wide, allowing the unyielding morning light to flood the space where 3 generations of family life were being systematically reduced to a series of uniform cardboard boxes. She was a whirlwind of practical energy, her movements sharp and rhythmic as she used a stiff bristle brush to clear the accumulated dust from the tops of the empty bookshelves, creating a fine, gray cloud that drifted through the beams of sunlight. Elena stood in the center of the room, holding a large roll of brown packing tape that crinkled loudly every time she shifted her weight. Her task was to seal the cartons that her sister had filled, an assignment that felt less like organization and more like a series of small, permanent closures. She moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, her fingers lingering on the cardboard flaps before she pulled the adhesive across the seams with a sharp, tearing sound that echoed through the bare house like a small fracture. Every empty space on the wall where a framed landscape or an old mirror had once hung left behind a clean, white rectangle against the slightly yellowed plaster, a visual scar that marked the absence of something familiar. The house was losing its memory, room by room, box by box, and Elena felt the loss with a physical ache that she carefully masked beneath a neutral, focused expression. Mateo arrived mid-morning, entering through the open terrace doors with a quiet, unobtrusive presence that instantly changed the gravity of the room. He carried a heavy iron toolbox, having promised Sofia he would dismantle the massive brass chandeliers that had hung from the center of the cedar ceiling since the house was built. He climbed up onto a sturdy wooden stepladder, his large hands moving with a practiced, technical efficiency as he loosened the rusted screws that held the heavy fixtures in place. From his elevated position, he could look down at the entire layout of the room, his gaze automatically tracking the quiet path that Elena was making between the stacks of boxes. The physical distance between them was only a few meters, yet the presence of Sofia, moving back and forth with her clipboard and her rolls of packing paper, created a complex obstacle course that they had to navigate with absolute silence. As Mateo lowered the first brass chandelier, its crystal pendants rattling together with a delicate, musical chime that sounded entirely out of place in the stripped room, Elena stepped forward to receive the heavy object. Their hands met beneath the cold metal frame, his large, calloused palms bracing the weight from above while her slender fingers curled around the central stem from below. For a long, unbroken moment, the entire momentum of the house clearance stopped. They stood frozen on either side of the wooden ladder, their eyes locked over the tarnished brass branches. In the cold, clear light of the morning, Mateo could see the faint smudges of dust on her cheek and the deep, nostalgic exhaustion in her dark eyes. He tightened his grip on the metal, ensuring she felt the absolute stability of his support before he slowly transferred the full weight of the fixture into her arms. It was a silent transfer of burdens, an acknowledgement that while the physical structures of her past were being dismantled, the emotional weight was something they were now carrying together. By early afternoon, the main salon had been reduced to a barren landscape of stacked cardboard and bare walls, its high ceiling bouncing the sound of their footsteps back to them with a hollow, mimicking resonance. Sofia carried the first load of boxes out to the courtyard where Diego was waiting with the truck, leaving Mateo and Elena alone in the center of the empty room for a single, fleeting minute. Elena walked to the bare patch of wall where her grandmother's portrait had hung for 50 years, her fingertips lightly tracing the dark edge of the outline left on the plaster. Mateo stepped off the ladder and stood beside her, his shadow falling over the clean white rectangle, completing the shape. He didn't offer a word of comfort, nor did she look for one. They simply stood in the quiet, dust-filled space, watching the pale sunlight shift across the empty floorboards, both of them fully aware that every box they sealed was a step closer to the final departure. Chapter 12, The Hidden Cove. The afternoon sun sat low and heavy over the rugged cliffs of Cadaqués, casting long, sharp shadows that cut across the dry, rocky terraces like dark fingers of ink. Escaping the oppressive, dusty atmosphere of the half-empty house where Sofia continued her relentless packing, Mateo had guided Elena out toward the wild, uncultivated fringe of the peninsula. He knew of a specific, narrow cleft in the limestone cliffs, a place known only to the local fishermen who had used it for generations to hide their nets during the fierce autumn tramontana storms. The path down was treacherous, a steep, vertical drop over loose fragments of dark slate that skittered away beneath their shoes and tumbled down into the boiling surf below. Mateo moved first, his large frame acting as a physical shield against the steep descent, his hand constantly reaching back to provide a steadying pivot point for Elena as she navigated the treacherous incline. When they finally stepped onto the floor of the hidden cove, the frantic noise of the wind on the upper cliffs vanished completely, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that felt almost cathedral-like. The cove was a perfect, tiny crescent of black pebble sand, completely enclosed by towering walls of volcanic rock that blocked out the rest of the world. The water here was not the cheerful turquoise of the public beaches, it was a deep, unmoving slate gray, thick with cold ocean currents and the dark green shadows of hidden kelp forests. The air smelled intensely of ancient salt, wet stone, and the bitter, sharp scent of dried wild fennel that clung to the crevices in the rock face. It was a landscape stripped of all summer pretense, raw and honest, offering a perfect mirror to the emotional reality that the two figures were carrying between them. Elena walked to the water's edge, her leather sandals crunching softly against the smooth, dark stones. She sat down on a large, flat boulder that had been polished to a high sheen by centuries of high tides, her bare feet dangling just a few inches above the foam of the small waves. Mateo did not sit beside her immediately, instead, he stood a few paces back, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes tracking the horizon where a single, distant container ship crawled along the boundary between the sea and the sky. The silence between them in this isolated amphitheater was absolute, a heavy, tangible substance that required no words to fill it. They had reached a point in their short summer where any spoken declaration would feel small, inadequate against the massive weight of the impending departure that hung over their remaining days. After a long time, Elena reached down into the shallow water, her fingers disappearing beneath the cold, clear surface to retrieve a small, perfectly round black pebble. She turned it over in her palm, letting the water slick its surface until it shone like a piece of polished obsidian. Without looking back, she held her hand out behind her, the stone resting on her open palm like a silent question. Mateo stepped forward, his boots sinking into the wet gravel, and closed the distance between them. He knelt beside the boulder, his large hand coming up to hover over hers. Instead of taking the stone, he slipped his fingers beneath her palm, bracing her hand with his own, his thumb lightly tracing the fine, delicate line of her wrist where her pulse beat with a steady, frantic rhythm. They remained in that exact position for what felt like hours, two statues framed by the dark, towering cliffs and the indifferent movement of the Mediterranean tide. The warmth of Mateo's skin was the only defense against the cold shadow that was slowly climbing up the rock wall behind them as the sun sank below the mountain ridge. Elena leaned her head back slightly, her hair brushing against his shoulder, her eyes closing as she absorbed the precise texture of the moment, the sound of the water, the smell of the salt, and the absolute certainty of his presence beside her. They both knew that this cove was a temporary sanctuary, a brief pause in a timeline that was accelerating toward an ending, but in the deep, honest silence of the hidden stone, the connection they had forged felt permanent, carved into the very geography of the coast. Chapter 13, Diego's Observation. The late afternoon sun had turned the harbor of Cadaqués into a sheet of beaten copper, its surface rippling with a heavy, metallic glare that made the eyes ache. It was that specific hour of the day when the wind usually died down, leaving the air completely still and thick with the scent of marine diesel, drying nets, and the hot asphalt of the fish market piers. Diego stood on the weathered timber deck of his family's wooden fishing vessel, his large, calloused hands working a heavy piece of coarse sandpaper back and forth along the grain of a new ash wood oar. His movements were rhythmic, unhurried, and perfectly attuned to the slow, lazy rocking of the boat against the heavy rubber fenders tied to the stone dock. He was a man whose entire life could be measured by the seasons of this harbor, a permanent fixture of the coast who had watched decades of summer visitors arrive with the heat and vanish with the first cold tramontana wind of September. From his vantage point on the deck, Diego had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire promenade and the wide stone ramp where the local fishermen dragged their skiffs out of the water. For the past hour, his attention had been subtly divided between the rough wood beneath his fingers and the two figures sitting on the low sea wall near the old customs house. Mateo and Elena had been there since the heat of midday began to break. They were sitting perfectly still, their shoulders nearly touching, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the blue of the sea dissolved into the pale haze of the afternoon sky. They hadn't moved for over 40 minutes, nor had they turned their faces toward one another to exchange a single word. To a casual tourist, they might have looked like an ordinary couple enjoying the view, but Diego's eyes, trained to spot the slightest shift in the weather or the subtle tension in a mooring line, saw something entirely different. He noticed the precise way Mateo's large notebook lay closed on his lap, the charcoal pen trapped between the pages but completely forgotten, an unprecedented neglect for an architect who usually sketched every arch and cornice within his field of vision. Diego watched his childhood friend's profile, the tight line of his jaw, the heavy, unblinking focus of his eyes, and the deliberate stiffness of his posture. It was the posture of a man who was actively trying to slow down the rotation of the earth, holding himself rigid against a current he knew he couldn't fight. Beside him, Elena sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her thumb tracing the edge of her silver ring in that repetitive, hypnotic circle that Diego had come to recognize over the past weeks. There was an invisible, hypercharged field of gravity between the two figures on the wall, a quiet pocket of air that seemed completely insulated from the noisy, practical reality of the harbor around them. Diego blew a layer of fine, pale with dust from the oar, his gaze lingering on the way the amber sunlight caught the edge of Elena's dark dress, making her silhouette stand out with a sharp, painful clarity against the glittering water. He felt a sudden, familiar ache in his own chest, a heavy wave of nostalgic sympathy for his friend. Diego had seen this specific choreography play out many times before on these very docks. It was the classic, unyielding tragedy of the summer coast. One person belonged to the soil and the stone, bound to return year after year to maintain the old family walls, while the other was merely a bird of passage, a temporary guest whose real life, career, and future were anchored in a distant city across the mountains. Diego knew that Sofia had already finalized the sale of the grandmother's house, and he had seen the moving truck schedule pinned to her clipboard. The countdown was no longer an abstract concept, it was a physical reality measured in hours. With a slow, deliberate sigh that was swallowed by the creaking of the ship's timbers, Diego set down the sandpaper and reached for a heavy canvas tarpaulin stacked near the wheelhouse. He began to unfold the thick, salt-stiffened fabric across the deck, his large boots making a dull, thumping sound against the wood that briefly broke the quiet of the pier. He did not walk over to the sea wall, nor did he make any gesture to interrupt the two figures. He understood the sacred boundary of their silence too well to breach it with a clumsy display of comfort. Instead, as he secured the copper eyelets of the tarp to the iron cleats on the gunwale, he maintained his quiet watch, his presence acting as a silent, protective buffer between the romantic couple and the busy, indifferent world of the fish market. The sun finally dipped below the high ridge of the mountain, casting a massive, cool blue shadow over the harbor, and Diego watched as Mateo slowly reached out his hand, his fingers resting flat on the cold stone wall just an inch away from Elena's. They didn't look at each other, but the movement was an acknowledgement that the light had changed, and as Diego pulled the heavy knots tight on his canvas cover, he knew he was securing the final fragments of a summer that his friend would be carrying as a ghost for the rest of his life. Chapter 14, The Packing of Tarpaulins. The physical dismantling of the summer paradise began in earnest on the second Tuesday of September, arriving not with a sudden storm but with the steady, administrative efficiency of the local municipal workers. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the main beach of Cadaqués was filled with the metallic clatter of heavy tools and the low, rhythmic grunting of men who had performed this exact task at the end of every season for generations. The long, neat rows of blue and white striped rental umbrellas that had structured the gray pebble shoreline for the past 3 months were being systematically ripped from the sand, their metal shafts stacked into the back of a waiting tractor like bundled firewood. The wide wooden boardwalks that allowed visitors to traverse the burning stones without blistering their feet were being unbolted piece by piece, their salt-whitened planks loaded onto heavy flatbed trucks, leaving behind only the deep, geometric scars in the gravel where they had rested. Mateo stood on the edge of the promenade, his arms resting on the rusted iron railing that separated the concrete walkway from the beach below. He was dressed in a thick, dark corduroy jacket to shield himself from the sharp morning breeze that was blowing directly off the water, bringing with it the cold, bitter scent of deep ocean kelp and wet iron. His notebook remained closed under his arm, his fingers tightly gripping the leather spine as he watched the space change. There was a profound, almost clinical violence to the process. Within a matter of hours, the visual language of relaxation and leisure was being completely erased from the landscape, replaced by the bare, unadorned reality of the winter coast. The large canvas tarpaulins that had served as awnings for the beachfront cafes were being unlashed from their iron frames, folded into heavy, stiff squares by the waiters, and carried into the dark cellars to be locked away until the following June. A few paces to his left, Elena was leaning against a stone pillar, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her oversized wool cardigan, her eyes tracking the movement of the tractor as it roared back and forth across the pebbles. She moved closer to Mateo, her boots crunching softly on the scattered gravel that had drifted onto the promenade during the previous night's high tide. She did not look at him, nor did he turn his head to acknowledge her approach, but their shoulders settled into that familiar, synchronized alignment that had become their default language over the past weeks. The physical proximity was their only defense against the heavy, industrial soundscape of the morning, the grinding of gears, the shouting of the workers, and the sharp, repeated cracking of ropes being pulled through brass pulleys. It was the sound of an expiration date being enforced. They watched a pair of workers struggle with a massive, sun-bleached canvas umbrella that had become jammed in its iron base near the water's edge. The fabric was stiff with months of salt crust and baked-in heat, resisting the men's efforts to fold it down until one of them struck the hinge with a heavy rubber mallet. The sharp, dull thud of the blow echoed across the half-empty bay, and with a sudden, collapsing sigh, the canvas folded in on itself, trapping the last pocket of summer air inside its dark folds before being tied shut with a piece of rough hemp twine. Elena's hand moved slightly inside her pocket, her fingers clenching into a tight fist as she witnessed the closure. It was an exact visual metaphor for what was happening in the upper quarter of the town, where Sophia was currently supervising the loading of the final crates into the moving van, sealing the remaining fragments of their family history into uniform cardboard blocks. The sun rose higher in the pale sky, but its light was thin, lacking the fierce, penetrating warmth that had characterized the golden afternoons of August. It illuminated the bare beach with a clinical clarity, exposing the trash that had been trapped beneath the wooden boardwalks for months, faded plastic caps, broken sunglasses, and rusty coins, all the cheap debris of a seasonal crowd that had already forgotten the coast existed. Mateo turned his gaze away from the beach, his eyes finding the small, delicate silver ring on Elena's finger as she rested her hand on the cold iron railing beside his. He reached out, his hand moving with a slow, deliberate weightlessness, his large thumb lightly tracing the fabric of her sleeve until his bare palm rested flat over the back of her cold fingers. They stood frozen in that quiet anchor of contact while the tractor roared past them one final time, its trailer piled high with the folded tarpaulins and dismantled frames of a summer that was already transforming into a memory before their very eyes. Chapter 15, The Final Sunday. The final Sunday of the vacation arrived with a heavy, static stillness that seemed to freeze the entire landscape of Cadaqués in a state of suspended animation. The morning tramontana wind had completely died down, leaving the Mediterranean as flat and dark as a sheet of polished slate, reflecting the pale, overcast sky with an eerie, mirror-like precision. Inside the small, ground-floor dining room of Diego's family house, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke, roasted sea bass, and the bitter sediment of local red wine. A single overhead lamp hung low over the massive oak table, casting a sharp, concentrated circle of amber light on the 4 plates and the simple glass carafe, while the corners of the room remained submerged in a deep, velvet shadow. It was a gathering that had been planned for days, a traditional farewell meal designed to mark the end of the season, yet the atmosphere around the board was thick with an unspoken weight that made every movement feel intensely deliberate. Diego sat at the head of the table, his large frame filling the high-backed wooden chair, his hands moving with a slow, careful efficiency as he used a silver fish knife to separate the delicate white meat from the bones of the grilled fish. Usually, these Sunday dinners were filled with the loud, familiar rhythms of local gossip and laughter that bounced off the thick stone walls, but today his broad face was settled into a serious, reflective mask. Beside him, Sophia sat straight and rigid, her eyes fixed on the small notebook where she had pinned the final receipts for the moving truck. Her hair was pulled back tightly, exposing the sharp, pragmatic lines of her jaw, her fingers drumming a faint, irregular tattoo against the edge of her plate. She had spent the morning labeling the last remaining crates in the upper house, and her presence at the table acted as a physical countdown clock, a reminder that the real world, with its strict logistics of schedules and deadlines, was waiting just beyond the threshold of the evening. Directly across from Sophia, Elena sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap beneath the edge of the tablecloth. She had barely touched the food on her plate, her focus entirely consumed by the small, arched window that looked out onto the darkening harbor. The light outside was failing rapidly, the pale gray sky turning into a deep, bruised indigo that lengthened the shadows of the empty stone piers. Every time the heavy iron pendulum of the grandfather clock in the hallway struck the half-hour, a subtle, microscopic tension would ripple through her posture, a slight tightening of her shoulders, a brief intake of breath that she carefully concealed beneath a neutral expression. She was fully aware that this was the last time the 4 of them would occupy the same physical space, the last time their lives would be held in this delicate, shared equilibrium before the current of the coming week pulled them apart. Mateo sat beside her, his large form casting a shadow that overlapped hers on the whitewashed wall behind them. He ate with a slow, mechanical precision, his eyes never truly leaving the pale, delicate profile of Elena's face against the dark wood of the paneling. The silence between the romantic couple was absolute, a perfect, insulated pocket of air that existed completely independent of the heavy, bureaucratic atmosphere that Sophia and Diego brought to the table. There was no need for words, no demand for declarations, the shared history of the past weeks, the mountain paths, the hidden cove, the silent hours on the terrace, hung between them like a physical object, solid and indestructible. Mateo reached out his left hand, his fingers moving with a slow, deliberate weightlessness across the rough grain of the table until his palm rested flat against the wood, just a fraction of an inch away from the sleeve of Elena's dark cardigan. The dinner concluded without the traditional clinking of glasses or the lingering over coffee that usually defined a Spanish Sunday afternoon. Sofia stood up first, her movements sharp and decisive as she began to stack the empty plates, the metallic clatter of the ceramic breaking the heavy silence of the room with a sudden, jarring finality. Diego followed her into the dark kitchen, his heavy boots making a dull, thumping sound against the floor tiles, leaving Mateo and Elena alone at the long table for one final, unbroken minute. The amber light of the lamp illuminated the scattered breadcrumbs and the stains of purple wine on the white cloth, a miniature landscape of a finished meal. Elena turned her face toward Mateo, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light of the window with an intensity that required no dialogue to convey its meaning. They simply sat together in the quiet room, watching the shadows stretch and merge across the floorboards, both of them fully aware that the final Sunday had set, and that the tomorrow they had been dreading for a month had finally arrived. Chapter 16, The Ticket Home. The digital reality of departure materialized on a Wednesday morning with a cold, blue glare that felt entirely disconnected from the natural rhythms of the coast. The sun had risen behind a high bank of autumn fog, turning the Bay of Cadaqués into a dull, opaque sheet of zinc that refused to reflect the light. Inside the small, stripped bedroom of her grandmother's house, Elena sat on the edge of a bare mattress, her knees pulled up toward her chest, the glowing screen of her tablet computer resting flat against the canvas fabric of her travel bag. The notification had arrived at precisely 7 o'clock, a mechanical automated message containing the digital boarding pass, the seat assignment, and the strict baggage limitations for the flight back to her northern studio. The stark, black and white grid of the barcode looked small and insignificant on the glass surface, yet it possessed a brutal, administrative gravity that instantly broke the fragile illusion of her remaining hours. She stared at the digital confirmation for a long time, her eyes tracking the sharp, geometric lines of the flight itinerary with a blank, unblinking focus. The numbers on the screen, the departure time, the flight number, the gate classification, operated in a linguistic system that had no room for the textures she had spent her summer collecting. It knew nothing of the rough, whitewashed mortar of the mountain alleys, the cold grit of the black pebbles in the hidden cove, or the precise, amber quality of the late afternoon shadows on the terrace. Her thumb moved over the smooth glass, tracing the edge of the screen in that repetitive, rhythmic circle that had become her silent anchor against the accelerating timeline. The soft, electronic hum of the device was the only sound in the empty room, a sterile, modern note that emphasized the absolute absence of the familiar summer soundscape. The door to the hallway stood wide open, revealing a clear view of Sofia's efficient progress through the upper floor. Her sister was currently sealing the last oversized crate with a series of sharp, violent pulls of the packing tape, the loud, plastic screeching echoing through the bare corridors like an accusation. Sofia moved with the unbrained confidence of someone who viewed the future as a series of boxes to be checked and transport trucks to be coordinated, entirely untroubled by the emotional vacuum being left behind in the house. For Sofia, the ticket home was a resolution, a successful conclusion to an administrative chore, and her quick, heavy footsteps on the floorboard sounded like a steady, industrial march toward the airport highway. A shadow fell across the bare threshold of the bedroom door, cutting off the pale light from the hallway window. Mateo was standing there. He was dressed in a dark, weathered canvas jacket, his large frame filling the timber frame of the door, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He did not ask to enter, nor did he make any gesture of intrusion, he simply stood at the boundary of her space, his eyes tracking the cold blue glow that illuminated Elena's face from below. He looked down at the tablet screen, his gaze catching the digital barcode before returning to her dark, exhausted eyes. The silence that settled between them in that stripped room was thick, heavy with the mutual recognition that their parallel realities were finally collapsing into a single, unyielding mathematical certainty. Mateo moved into the room with a slow, deliberate weightlessness, his heavy leather boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards. He knelt beside the canvas travel bag, his large, calloused hand reaching out to rest flat on the bare mattress just an inch away from her foot. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a solid, radiating wall of stability against the digital countdown burning on the screen. Elena turned the tablet over, setting the glass face down against the fabric, plunging the small room back into the soft, gray light of the autumn morning. In the renewed shadows, they shared a long, nostalgic look that required no dialogue to convey its meaning, a silent validation of the ache they were both carrying. They sat together on the edge of the bare bed, listening to the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves against the harbor piers, both of them fully aware that the digital ticket had already initiated their separation, leaving them with nothing but the remaining hours to memorize the exact shape of what they were about to lose. Chapter 17, The Weight of Keys. The final administrative act of the summer took place on a Thursday afternoon under a sky that had turned the color of soiled sheep's wool, heavy with the promise of rain that refused to fall. The old, thick-walled house of the grandmother stood completely empty now, its rooms stripped of the carpets, the porcelain lamps, and the faded photographs that had anchored the family to this stretch of the coast for over 60 years. All that remained in the center of the bare, whitewashed kitchen was the massive stone sink and, resting on its cold marble edge, the heavy iron ring holding the 4 keys to the property. They were ancient objects, hand-forged by a local blacksmith at the turn of the century, their surfaces dark and pitted with a thick patina of iron oxide and salt crust that rubbed off onto the fingers like fine soot. Sophia stood by the open door that led out to the courtyard, her leather handbag tucked securely under her arm, her eyes scanning the bare walls with a cold, professional assessment. Her job was finished, the inventory had been checked, the transport van had already cleared the town borders, and the real estate agency in Girona had confirmed the receipt of the deposit. She reached out and picked up the iron ring, the heavy keys making a sharp, metallic clatter that sounded incredibly loud and hollow in the vacant house. She did not look back at the rooms where she had spent her childhood summers. For Sophia, the keys were no longer symbols of memory or heritage, but merely the final items on an administrative checklist that needed to be surrendered to the local notary before the 5 o'clock train. Elena was standing a few feet away, her back against the cold stone frame of the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible. She watched her sister's efficient movements with a dull, unblinking focus, her eyes tracking the iron ring as Sophia slipped it into a padded envelope. The sound of that metal sliding into the paper was the sound of a border closing. The house was no longer theirs, it was now a legal entity, a piece of premium coastal real estate waiting for its new owners to repaint the shutters and replace the old timber floors. Elena's hand moved instinctively to her cardigan pocket, her fingers finding the small, loose thread at the seam and twisting it into a tight knot, a silent, repetitive motion that matched the heavy, rhythmic thumping of her heart. A shadow broke the gray light of the doorway as Diego entered the kitchen, his large boots leaving dark, wet tracks on the clean terracotta tiles. He had walked up from the fish market to help with the final lockup, his canvas jacket still retaining the sharp, familiar scent of the harbor, brine, tar, and engine oil. Behind him, Mateo followed silently, his head slightly lowered to clear the low wooden lintel of the door. The 4 of them stood in the empty room, arranged in a stiff, accidental rectangle that mirrored the geometric bareness of the space around them. There was no conversation, no attempt to fill the void with polite sentimentality, the emptiness of the house was too absolute to allow for casual words. Diego stepped forward, his massive, calloused hand reaching out to receive the padded envelope from Sophia. He was the permanent guardian of this street, the neighbor who would watch the shutters bang in the winter storms and ensure the roof tiles remained intact until the new keys were cut. He gave a single, slow nod to Sophia, a silent acknowledgement of a contract fulfilled. Mateo remained near the back of the room, his eyes fixed entirely on Elena's pale face against the gray window light. He didn't move toward her, nor did he reach out his hand as he had done on the beach or the terrace. The presence of the keys and the heavy, official atmosphere brought by Sophia and Diego had created an invisible barrier that neither of them dared to cross. Instead, they shared a long, unyielding look across the bare kitchen, a silent pact of memory that required no dialogue to articulate its weight. As Sophia took her keys out to lock the front door from the outside, the heavy iron bolt clicked into place with a definitive, mechanical thud, plunging the interior into a permanent shadow and leaving the 4 figures outside on the narrow stone alley, where the first cold drop of autumn rain finally hit the dry pavement. Chapter 18, The Station at Figueres. The dawn that accompanied the departure from the coast was non-existent, replaced instead by a thick, heavy blanket of Pyrenean fog that rolled down the mountain passes and smothered the inland valleys in a featureless, grey obscurity. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the small station at Figueras Villafant had transformed into a sterile, concrete island surrounded by an ocean of white mist. The sharp, mechanical hiss of the overhead high-voltage lines vibrated through the damp air, a constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to match the cold, modern efficiency of the platform. Diego's old off-road vehicle sat idling in the gravel parking lot outside, its exhaust pluming white plumes of steam into the chilly air, a solitary monument to the coastal world they had left behind just an hour earlier. The four of them stood beneath the minimalist concrete canopy of the main platform, their collars turned up against the damp chill that crawled up from the iron tracks. Sophia stood a few paces ahead, her arms crossed over her leather jacket, her eyes scanning the digital arrival board with a sharp, impatient focus. She held the 2 train tickets tightly between her fingers, the crisp paper rustling every time a gust of wind swept across the open concrete. For Sophia, this platform was a gateway back to her structured, professional life, a necessary escape from the heavy, nostalgic dust of the grandmother's house. Her foot tapped a rapid, irregular rhythm against her small rolling suitcase, an implicit countdown that signaled her eagerness to cross the border and leave the complications of the summer behind. Elena stood perfectly still beside a heavy steel pillar, her hands buried deep within the pockets of her oversized wool coat, her eyes fixed on the blank, white wall of fog where the tracks disappeared into the distance. The physical distance between her and the coast was already expanding, yet her internal landscape remained firmly anchored to the white stone alleys and the dark, slate-gray water of the hidden cove. She felt completely unmoored in this environment of glass, steel, and digital timetables. Her fingers inside her pocket were tightly wrapped around the small piece of frosted green sea glass she had taken from the old dory, her thumb tracing its rough, salt-etched edges in a desperate attempt to maintain a physical connection to the reality that was slipping away from her with every passing minute. Mateo remained slightly behind her, his large frame blocking the cold draft that whistled through the open gaps of the station architecture. He had not spoken since they loaded the luggage into Diego's car in the dark of the morning, and his silence now was absolute, a heavy, dense weight that seemed to insulate him from the busy movements of the other passengers on the platform. His hands were stuffed deep into his corduroy jacket, his eyes locked onto the back of Elena's dark head, tracking the way the fine mist was settling onto the wool fibers of her collar, turning them into a silver web. There was an intense, tragic clarity to his gaze. He was a man collecting the final, microscopic details of a silhouette he knew he would soon have to reconstruct entirely from memory. Diego stood near the edge of the platform, his large, calloused hands resting on the handles of Elena's heavy trunk. His presence was the only remaining link to the harbor, his clothes still carrying the faint, bitter scent of marine diesel and dry fennel that felt completely foreign in this sterile station. When the distant, rhythmic thumping of the incoming high-speed train began to vibrate through the concrete beneath their feet, Diego stepped forward, his heavy boots making a dull clatter as he lifted the luggage onto the metal transport cart. He did not offer any words of comfort, nor did he attempt a clumsy embrace. Instead, he simply placed his massive hand flat against Mateo's shoulder for a brief second, a silent gesture of solidarity between two friends who understood the language of endurance far better than any formal farewell. The train burst through the wall of fog with a sudden, deafening roar, its bright white headlights cutting a violent path through the gray mist before its sleek, silver nose came to a smooth, grinding halt along the platform. The automatic doors slid open with a sharp, pneumatic hiss, unleashing a wave of warm, climate-controlled air that smelled of plastic and stale coffee. Sophia moved instantly, her rolling bag clicking loudly across the yellow safety tiles as she stepped onto the train without looking back. Elena remained frozen for a single, fracturing second, her eyes meeting Mateo's across the narrow gap between the platform and the carriage door. It was a look stripped of all pretense, filled with a deep, nostalgic grief that required no dialogue to articulate its weight. Mateo did not reach out to stop her, nor did he step across the threshold. He simply maintained his steady, unblinking gaze, offering her a final, rock-solid image of devotion as she slowly climbed the metal steps and disappeared into the dark interior of the coach, leaving him alone on the concrete platform as the doors sealed shut with a definitive, mechanical click. Chapter 19, The Leftover Horizon. The return journey from the inland railway station back to the coast was marked by an absolute, heavy silence that seemed to expand within the cramped cabin of the off-road vehicle. Diego drove with his usual steady, mechanical focus, his large hands resting loosely on the worn leather of the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the winding asphalt of the mountain pass as it climbed back over the rocky ridge of the Peña. The heavy Pyrenean fog that had shrouded the station at Figueres began to thin as they neared the peninsula, tearing into ragged, grey ribbons that drifted lazily across the dry olive terraces and the ancient stone walls. Mateo sat in the passenger seat, his head resting back against the cold glass of the window, his gaze fixed entirely on the empty side mirror where the interior of the car reflected nothing but the vacant back seat where Elena's canvas travel bags had rested only an hour before. When the vehicle finally rounded the last high crest and began its long descent into the basin of Cadaqués, the town reappeared below them, stripped entirely of its summer animation. From this elevated perspective, the white houses looked like a collection of bleached bones scattered along the edge of the dark, indifferent sea. The harbor was completely empty of the colorful pleasure boats and sleek yachts that had crowded the mooring lines during August. All that remained were the heavy, black-hulled fishing trawlers tied securely to the stone piers, their tall masts swaying slightly in the cold autumn swell. The landscape had shrunk back down to its permanent, winter dimensions, a quiet, isolated world that had no memory of the seasonal crowds that had filled its streets. Diego parked the car near the fish market docks, the engine dying with a loud, sputtering sigh that left the cabin instantly exposed to the raw roar of the sea wind. He did not get out immediately. Instead, he reached forward and unlatched a small wooden compartment in the dashboard, withdrawing a pair of heavy, grease-stained canvas working gloves. He pulled them on slowly, his large knuckles stretching the stiff fabric with a series of rhythmic, creaking sounds that broke the heavy quiet. He gave Mateo a single, firm look, a silent invitation to return to the practical, physical labor of the harbor where there was always a net to be mended or a hull to be scraped before the winter storms. It was his way of offering an anchor, a reminder that while the people of passage had vanished, the stone and the sea remained. Mateo nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement of his head, but he did not follow his friend down to the boats. Instead, he stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the edge of the deserted promenade, his heavy boots making a sharp, solitary sound against the damp concrete. He walked past the closed-shuttered facades of the beachfront cafés where the folded tarpaulins were now locked away in the dark, his steps guided by a quiet, internal momentum that drew him back toward the rocky promontory near the old customs house. The wind was fierce here, blowing directly off the open water and spraying a fine, cold mist of salt water across his face, but he did not turn back. He climbed up onto the low stone sea wall where they had sat during the final Sunday afternoon, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his corduroy jacket. The stone was freezing to the touch, stripped entirely of the baked-in warmth that the summer sun had provided. He looked out at the distant, gray line of the horizon where the sky and the sea met in an unbroken, featureless blur. There was an immense, hollow clarity to the space before him. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against his leather notebook, but he didn't pull it out. He knew there was nothing left to sketch. The summer was no longer something to be recorded or observed, it had transitioned into a permanent, internal architecture, a collection of soft shadows, white stone, and silent hours that he would be carrying alone through the long, cold months ahead. He stood on the edge of the wall until the twilight began to turn the water into a deep, bruised purple, fully aware that the horizon was now completely his own, a vast, empty space where her silhouette had been permanently engraved into the stone. Chapter 20, The Texture of Longing. The first true frost of November arrived in the dead of night, descending upon the coastal cliffs of Cadaqués not with the violent roar of a tramontana storm, but with a silent, crystalline precision that left the entire peninsula coated in a delicate layer of silver ice by morning. The sharp, cold air smelled intensely of frozen slate, deep ocean brine, and the faint, bitter smoke of wood fires burning in the low hearths of the lower town. Mateo stood on the high terrace of his studio, his large hands wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee that pluming a steady, fragile plume of steam into the chilly air. His eyes were fixed on the panoramic view below, where the whitewashed houses looked completely dormant, their heavy timber shutters closed tight against the winter cold, turning the once vibrant summer sanctuary into a quiet, monochrome fortress of stone and slate. On the wooden table behind him lay his large leather-bound notebook, its pages turned to the very back, where the sketches had long since ceased to capture the physical architecture of the town. The recent drawings were entirely different, they were studies of texture, form, and shadow. There were pages covered in the precise, technical representation of a hand-painted blue leaf pattern on a faded ceramic tile, the rough, salt-etched grain of a piece of frosted green sea glass, and the long, dramatic angles of amber light throwing a silhouette across an empty alleyway. Without the physical presence of the seasonal crowd, Mateo's work had become a private archival project, a systematic reconstruction of a single summer that had been permanently engraved into his consciousness. He had spent the long, quiet evenings of autumn translating the silent hours they had shared into a permanent visual lexicon, ensuring that the geography of the coast would always retain her memory. 1,000 miles to the north, inside a spacious, minimalist studio apartment where the gray light of a northern winter filtered through massive industrial windows, Elena sat before a large wooden loom. The room was completely silent, insulated from the distant, roaring hum of the city traffic below by thick double panes of glass. The floorboards around her were clean and bare, save for a few stray strands of colored textile fibers that had drifted from her workspace. She moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm that had been perfected over years of artistic discipline, her slender fingers weaving a thick strand of mustard-yellow linen thread through a complex network of beige and burgundy cords. She was working on a new collection of handcrafted textiles, each piece defined by an intense, dense stitch structure that preserved the exact structural integrity of traditional macrame knots, yet elevated by the inclusion of smooth pearl handles and minimalist gold hardware. As she pulled the wooden batten down to tighten the weave, the rough texture of the linen fibers scraped against her skin, a tactile sensation that instantly triggered a vivid, internal landscape. She did not look at the pattern template pinned to the wall beside her, instead, her eyes were half closed, her mind tracking the precise configuration of a hidden cove on the Spanish coast, the cold grit of the black pebble sand, the deep slate-gray water, and the absolute stability of a large, calloused hand bracing hers over a polished stone. Every knot she tied on the loom was a silent articulation of that memory, a physical manifestation of an unspoken promise to hold on to the texture of that summer. The work was her dialogue, her way of speaking across an immense geographical divide without the necessity of spoken words, transforming the heavy weight of her nostalgia into a tangible, enduring substance that she could touch and shape with her own hands. The sun began to set over the northern roofs, casting a pale, horizontal ray of light across the studio floor that caught the edge of her finished textile, illuminating the dense patterns until they seemed to radiate a quiet, internal warmth. At that exact same moment on the southern coast, the twilight was turning the waters of the Cadaqués Bay into a deep, bruised purple, the first harbor lamp flicking on with a dull, yellow hum. Mateo walked to the edge of his terrace, his fingers lightly tracing the cold stone railing where they had once stood together to watch the end of August. The physical distance between them was absolute, a reality governed by separate lives, distinct careers, and different latitudes, yet as the blue dusk settled over both of their worlds, the parallel architectures of their creativity remained perfectly synchronized. They were no longer mourning an ending, instead, through the silent, enduring labor of stone and thread, they had built a permanent sanctuary for their shared summer, a timeless landscape where the texture of longing had successfully crossed the border into immortality.